In 1983, a Raytheon Radarange commercial microwave oven sitting in a Lockheed skunk works break room began disrupting classified telemetry from a KH-11 reconnaissance satellite orbiting 200 miles above the Mojave Desert. The technicians dismissed it as instrument error until the pattern emerged. Every time someone reheated coffee at 11:47 a.m., the satellite's synthetic aperture radar feed dissolved into static for exactly 93 seconds. What started as a mundane kitchen appliance malfunction would accidentally expose a vulnerability in SIGINT architecture that the NSA had spent 14 years trying to keep buried, and the solution involved neither software patches nor hardware but rather a repurposed Soviet jamming technique stolen from a defector's notebook during the closing days of the Korean War. Before we dive into this electromagnetic rabbit hole, if you're fascinated by the hidden intersections of Cold War technology and accidental hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This channel excavates the technical mysteries that shaped modern surveillance, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. The microwave oven in question wasn't standard issue. Raytheon's 1982 Radarange model RR-7T featured a magnetron tube calibrated to 461 GHz, 41 MHz higher than the civilian standard, because it had been assembled from surplus components, originally destined for an APG-63 fire control radars in F-15 Eagles. This narrow frequency deviation placed its third harmonic emission at 7.383 GHz, which happened to sit precisely within the X-band downlink window that KH-11 Canon satellites used to transmit synthetic aperture radar imagery to ground stations at Fort Beaver and Bad Aibling Station in Bavaria. The overlap was never intentional, never documented in any frequency allocation table, and wouldn't have mattered at all except for one detail. The Skunk Works facility sat directly beneath the satellite's descending node. That brief 8-minute window when orbital geometry aligned the spacecraft's antenna gain pattern with the California desert, and the microwave, positioned near a west-facing window with a metal frame, created an accidental waveguide that focused the harmonic emission into a narrow beam aimed skyward like an upside-down spotlight. Nobody noticed for 6 weeks, because the disruption only occurred when 3 conditions converged simultaneously. The satellite had to be passing overhead in its descending node. The microwave had to be running at full power, which required heating something dense and wet. Typically, the engineer's morning coffee reheated after a long meeting, and the building's HVAC system had to be cycling its compressor, which created a standing wave pattern in the sheet metal ductwork that amplified the third harmonic by 17 decibels. On March 14th, all 3 conditions aligned during a priority imaging pass over the Baikonur Cosmodrome, and the resulting signal corruption destroyed 4 hours of irreplaceable reconnaissance data, showing the assembly of what analysts later identified as the first Energia heavy-lift launch vehicle. The investigation began with the satellite itself. Engineers at TRW, the prime contractor for the KH-11 program, spent 2 weeks running diagnostics on the spacecraft's traveling wavetube amplifier, suspecting a cascade failure in the power supply regulation circuit. They found nothing. The focus shifted to ground stations, particularly the massive dish arrays at Fort Beaver. that received the encrypted downlink through a series of frequent protocols designed specifically to resist jamming. Technicians replaced waveguide sections, recalibrated phase-locked loops, even swapped out entire receiver chains. But the interference persisted with metronomic regularity. It always happened at 11:47 a.m. Pacific Time, always lasted 93 seconds, and always coincided with satellite pulses over Southern California. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Captain Elena Vasquez, a signals intelligence analyst on loan from the Air Force's Electronic Security Command, had been studying Soviet radar jamming techniques used against U.S. reconnaissance flights in the early 60s. She noticed that the interference pattern matched something called a heterodyne injection attack, where a weak local oscillator signal at just the right frequency could desensitize a receiver by forcing its automatic gain control to reduce sensitivity. The technique had been pioneered by a Soviet engineer named Pyotr Efemtsev, whose theoretical work on electromagnetic scattering later became the mathematical foundation for American stealth aircraft. Vasquez hypothesized that someone had deliberately positioned a transmitter near the satellite ground track, but the signal strength calculations didn't add up to cause the observed disruption. The source would need to be radiating at least 40 watts of effective radiated power directly into the satellite's antenna side lobe, and even the most sophisticated Soviet jamming truck couldn't achieve that kind of precision from ground level. The answer emerged during a routine facilities inspection when a contractor noticed that the break room microwave shared a power circuit with a bank of oscilloscopes in the adjacent laboratory. Every time the microwave activated, it created a brief voltage sag that triggered a protective relay in the oscilloscope power supply, which in turn generated a 50-millisecond burst of broadband RF noise. That noise, coupled into the building's grounding system, traveled through the structural steel framework and radiated from the window frames. The effect was minuscule under normal circumstances, but the window frames, each measuring exactly 41 centimeters across, formed an accidental array of slot antennas resonant at 7.3 gigahertz. When the microwave's third harmonic added coherently to the window frame radiation, the combined signal became strong enough to trigger the satellite's automatic gain control, effectively blinding it for the duration of the interference. The initial response was predictable. Security officers wanted to classify the entire incident, remove the microwave, and pretend nothing had happened. But the engineers recognized something more significant. If a $20 appliance could accidentally jam a billion-dollar satellite, then adversaries could do the same thing deliberately with far more sophisticated equipment. The vulnerability wasn't in the microwave or the building or even the satellite's receiver design. It lay in the fundamental architecture of space-based reconnaissance, which relied on predictable orbital mechanics and fixed frequency allocations that any sufficiently motivated opponent could exploit. That realization triggered a comprehensive review of electromagnetic compatibility across the entire National Reconnaissance Office portfolio. Analysts discovered that civilian radar installations, airport surveillance systems, even certain models of police speed guns could theoretically interfere with satellite downlinks under specific geometric conditions. The problem wasn't theoretical interference. It was statistical certainty. With thousands of potential emitters scattered across every satellite ground track, The probability of accidental jamming approached unity over a long enough time horizon. The military had spent decades hardening its space assets against deliberate attacks, but had completely overlooked the threat from unintentional emitters operating in adjacent frequency bands. The solution came from that defector's notebook Elena Vasquez had been studying. In 1952, a Soviet radar engineer named Grigory Kisanko had defected to the West through Turkey, bringing with him detailed schematics of a frequency-agile jamming system designed to disrupt American B-29 bomber navigation radars. Kisanko's approach didn't try to overpower the target signal. Instead, it injected carefully timed pulses that corrupted the receiver's phase-locked loop, causing it to lose lock and spend precious seconds reacquiring the signal. The technique required exquisite timing, picosecond-level precision that was impossible to achieve with 1950s vacuum tube technology, which is why Kisanko's system never worked reliably in practice. But by 1983, digital signal processors had advanced to the point where that kind of precision became routine. The engineers repurposed Kisanko's technique in reverse. Instead of jamming an enemy radar, they would use it to protect their own satellite receivers from accidental interference. The solution involved adding a secondary receiver channel that monitored for unexpected signals in adjacent frequency bands. When it detected potential interference, a digital signal processor would predict when the satellite's main receiver would lose lock and preemptively switch to a backup frequency. Before the disruption occurred, the system relied on the same kind of phase-locked loop manipulation that Kisanko had pioneered, except this time the goal was stability rather than chaos. Implementation required modifying every ground station in the network, adding new signal processing hardware, and completely rewriting the frequency management protocols that govern satellite communications. The modification program took 14 months and cost $47 million, a staggering sum for what amounted to fixing a problem caused by a microwave oven. But the investment paid unexpected dividends. The new frequency-agile receivers proved remarkably resistant to deliberate jamming as well, not because they were more powerful, but because they were unpredictable. Soviet electronic warfare units that had spent years mapping American satellite frequencies suddenly found their intercept receivers chasing ghosts, unable to maintain lock-on signals that hopped erratically across the X-band spectrum. The accidental discovery of a vulnerability had led to an accidental breakthrough in anti-jamming technology. The microwave itself became a classified artifact, rather than destroying it or relegating it to storage. The NSA requisitioned the device for its technical museum at Fort Meade, where it remains on display in a restricted access gallery dedicated to electromagnetic warfare. The placard describes it only as a commercial appliance that contributed to advancements in signal processing, with no mention of satellites, reconnaissance, or the peculiar chain of events that transformed a kitchen appliance into a national security threat. Visitors who lacked the appropriate clearances walked past it without a second glance, never suspecting that the unremarkable metal box played a pivotal role in one of the Cold War's strangest technical intelligence stories. But the deeper implications of the incident extended far beyond jamming and counter-jamming. The microwave oven's accidental interference revealed a fundamental asymmetry in Cold War surveillance architecture. American reconnaissance satellites operated under the assumption that space was a sanctuary. a pristine environment free from the electromagnetic clutter that plagued ground-based systems. The reality was far messier. Every satellite passing overhead swam through an invisible ocean of radio frequency, emissions from thousands of terrestrial sources, each one a potential source of interference or deception. The Soviets had understood this from the beginning, which is why their early warning radars operated on frequencies deliberately chosen to minimize interference from civilian sources. American systems, designed in an era when spectrum management was less critical, had inadvertently created vulnerabilities that adversaries could exploit. The response involved more than just technical fixes. It required a fundamental rethinking of how space-based assets operated in contested electromagnetic environments. Program managers began incorporating electromagnetic compatibility testing into satellite, designed from the earliest conceptual phases, simulating not just deliberate jamming but also the cumulative effect of thousands of civilian emitters operating simultaneously. New satellites receive frequency-agile downlinks as standard equipment rather than expensive upgrades. Ground stations installed adaptive filters that could identify and suppress interference in real time. The entire architecture evolved from a fragile system dependent on electromagnetic silence to a robust network capable of operating in the noisiest possible environment. By 1987, the lessons learned from the microwave incident had propagated throughout the intelligence community. The National Security Agency published a classified technical manual on unintentional electromagnetic emissions, documenting hundreds of cases where civilian equipment had inadvertently compromised military systems. The Defense Intelligence Agency established a dedicated office to track potential interference sources, maintaining databases of radar installations, broadcast transmitters, and industrial equipment that might affect satellite operations. Even the Federal Communications Commission got involved, quietly adjusting frequency allocation tables to create guard bands around critical military frequencies. The microwave oven remained in service at Skunk Works for another 8 years. Long after the satellite vulnerability had been fixed, engineers kept it as a reminder that the most dangerous threats often emerge from unexpected directions. That complexity creates emergent behaviors, impossible to predict through analysis alone. Someone taped a handwritten note to the door that read, "Caution. This appliance is a threat to national security." A joke that wasn't entirely a joke. New employees heard the story during orientation, usually delivered with enough embellishment that the truth became difficult to separate from legend. Some versions claimed the microwave had jammed Soviet satellites instead of American ones, that it had been deliberately modified by a foreign agent, that it had somehow transmitted classified information through its harmonic emissions. The truth was simultaneously more mundane and more troubling. No one had intended to create a satellite jammer. No one had deliberately exploited a vulnerability or engaged in sabotage. The interference emerged purely from the interaction of multiple systems, each one functioning exactly as designed, combining in ways that nobody had anticipated. It was a perfect example of what systems engineers call emergent behavior, where the whole becomes dangerously different from the sum of its parts. The microwave generated harmonics because all magnetron tubes generate harmonics. The window frames resonated because their dimensions happened to match the wavelength. The satellite was vulnerable because its receiver design prioritized sensitivity over interference. rejection. None of these factors was a problem in isolation, but together they created a failure mode that defeated billions of dollars of defensive systems. At precisely 28 minutes into the investigation, a secondary discovery emerged that changed everything the analysts thought they understood. While reviewing historical telemetry data, a technician noticed that the interference pattern had actually begun 6 months earlier than initially believed, but it had been occurring at 3:22 a.m. local time. When the satellite passed over a different location, that earlier interference had been attributed to atmospheric ducting, a well-known phenomenon where radio waves refract through temperature inversions and propagate far beyond their normal range. But the new analysis revealed something more subtle. The 3:22 a.m. interference wasn't coming from California at all. It originated from a similar Raytheon microwave oven installed in a different Lockheed facility in Sunnyvale, 70 miles north. That facility also had metal window frames resonant at X-band frequencies. It also had a break room positioned near a west-facing window, and critically, it was staffed by a night shift whose members had established a ritual of reheating dinner precisely at 3:22 a.m. during their mid-shift break. The realization was staggering. The vulnerability wasn't unique to one building, or one microwave, or one specific set of circumstances. It was systemic, embedded in the very architecture of how aerospace companies designed their facilities and how military satellites allocated their frequencies. Anywhere a sufficiently powerful microwave oven sat near a metal structure with the right resonant dimensions, positioned under a satellite ground track, the potential for interference existed. The investigation team calculated that at least 47 other locations across the United States met the geometric and electromagnetic criteria for accidental jamming. Most would never cause problems because the timing wouldn't align, but some would, and there was no practical way to identify which ones without testing each location individually. The technical analysis grew increasingly speculative as engineers tried to model the full scope of the vulnerability. Could adversaries deliberately exploit this phenomenon? The answer was obviously yes, but implementing it would be surprisingly difficult. Creating the interference required precise knowledge of satellite ephemeris data, timing accurate to within a few seconds, and careful positioning of emitters under the orbital ground track. Any competent signals intelligence service could gather that information, but the effort would be enormous compared to simply building a conventional jammer. The real threat wasn't deliberate exploitation, but rather the possibility that other accidental emitters existed, unknown and undocumented, potentially disrupting critical intelligence collection during moments of international crises. Some analysts pushed the speculation further. If microwave ovens could jam satellites, what other civilian devices might pose similar threats? Airport radar systems operated at similar frequencies with far higher power levels. Weather radars transmitted continuously rather than in short bursts. Television broadcast towers radiated kilowatts of power across broad frequency ranges. The cumulative electromagnetic environment surrounding any satellite ground track was orders of magnitude more complex than the simplified models used in system design. Every device with a magnetron, klystron, or traveling wave tube was potentially a source of interference. Every metal structure was potentially a resonant antenna. The number of possible failure modes was essentially infinite. The cryptographic implications added another layer of concern. The satellite downlink used an encryption system called Pac-Man. which relied on precise timing, synchronization between the spacecraft transmitter and ground receiver. If interference disrupted that timing even briefly, the receiver would lose sync and require several seconds to re-establish the encrypted channel. During that gap, the satellite would continue transmitting, but the ground station couldn't decrypt the data. Those lost seconds represented gaps in coverage, blind spots where adversaries could potentially conduct activities unobserved. In the worst case, a sophisticated opponent might deliberately create interference timed to coincide with critical events, creating windows of invisibility within the surveillance net. The engineering team proposed several exotic solutions that were ultimately rejected as impractical. One involved deploying a constellation of secondary satellites to relay data through multiple paths, ensuring that interference in one channel wouldn't disrupt the entire link. Another suggested moving satellite downlinks to optical frequencies where interference from microwave ovens would be impossible, but the technology for space-based laser communications wasn't mature enough for operational deployment. A third approach advocated for completely autonomous satellites that stored imagery internally and only transmitted data when safely over the ocean, far from any terrestrial interference sources. Each solution was technically sound, but prohibitively expensive and years away from implementation. The final solution, the frequency ideal receiver system adapted from Kasunko's Defector notebook, represented a pragmatic compromise. It didn't eliminate the vulnerability, it merely reduced the probability of successful interference to acceptable levels. Satellites would still experience occasional disruptions, but the adaptive frequency hopping would minimize data loss and make deliberate jamming far more difficult. The system wasn't perfect, but perfection was impossible. The electromagnetic spectrum had become too crowded, too chaotic, too full of unintended interactions for any single technical fix to solve the problem completely. The broader lesson resonated throughout the intelligence community for decades afterward. Complex systems fail in complex ways, often through mechanisms that seem absurd in retrospect. A microwave oven jams a satellite. A misaligned antenna disrupts GPS navigation. A solar flare corrupts encrypted communications. Each failure reveals hidden dependencies, unexpected couplings between systems that were never intended to interact. The solution isn't to eliminate complexity. That's impossible in systems as sophisticated as modern reconnaissance satellites. Instead, the goal is resilience, building architectures that can tolerate failures, adapt to unexpected conditions, and continue operating even when individual components behave in surprising ways. The Raytheon Radarange modular R70 still sits in its climate control display case at Fort Meade, a monument to unintended consequences and accidental discoveries. Occasionally, senior engineers bring new hires to see it, using the unassuming appliance as a teaching tool. The lesson isn't about microwave ovens, or satellites, or electromagnetic interference. It's about humility, about recognizing that even the most carefully designed systems contain blind spots, that the most dangerous vulnerabilities often hide in plain sight, that sometimes a $20 kitchen appliance can expose weaknesses that billion-dollar engineering programs never anticipated. So what really happened in that break room in 1983? We know about the microwave, the satellite, the accidental resonance. But questions remain. Were there other incidents that were never documented, never investigated, never connected to their true cause? How many intelligence failures throughout the Cold War might have resulted not from sophisticated adversary actions, but from mundane electromagnetic interference? And perhaps, most intriguingly, did Soviet engineers ever discover similar vulnerabilities in their own systems? Or did they avoid the problem entirely through different design philosophies? The documents that might answer those questions remain classified, buried in archives that won't be opened for decades. If you found this deep dive into Cold War electromagnetic archaeology fascinating, there are dozens more stories like this hidden in the technical history of intelligence collection, unexpected failures, accidental discoveries, and the brilliant improvisation that often emerged from chaos. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss future episodes. And drop a comment below with your theory about what other everyday devices might have been secretly interfering with classified systems. The electromagnetic spectrum is vast, crowded, and full of secrets waiting to be uncovered. Thanks for watching.